Retired war dog doesn't recognize his former veteran, but what unfolds will leave you breathless. The Arizona sunset cast a kaleidoscope of orange and purple hues across the rugged mountain skyline. Jason Carter, a 37-year-old Army veteran, trudged toward the modest animal shelter on the outskirts of town, his weathered boots scuffing against the pavement. Each step echoed the burdens of his past, a life filled with weighty choices and haunting memories. Since leaving the military 2 years ago, Jason had been grasping for something to fill the emptiness inside him. Jobs, counseling, and even long solitary hikes through the desert had failed to mend the void. Max, his steadfast German shepherd and combat partner, had been by his side during the most perilous missions. But after an injury, Max was retired, and they'd been separated. Now, Jason found himself here at his sister Olivia's urging. She was convinced another dog could help Jason rebuild what he'd lost. He had been skeptical, but a small, stubborn flicker of hope had drawn him in. The shelter was humble, with rusty chain-link fences and a handful of patched-up kennels. The sharp tang of disinfectant lingered in the air, mingling with sporadic barks that punctuated the quiet. Jason walked slowly through the narrow aisles, his eyes scanning each cage. Dogs of all shapes and sizes reacted to him. Some barked eagerly, tails wagging in desperate attempts to win his attention. Others watched in silence, their gazes heavy with resignation. Yet none stirred the connection he sought, none mirrored the fire and loyalty he had seen in Max. As Jason was about to leave, a staff member, a young woman with a gentle demeanor, approached him. "Mr. Carter, we actually have a German shepherd in the back that might interest you. He came in a few weeks ago," she said, her voice kind but hesitant. Jason froze, a mix of hope and trepidation surging through him. "A German shepherd?" he asked, his voice hoarse. Without waiting for her reply, he nodded and followed her to a quieter area of the shelter. In a dimly lit kennel at the far end, a large dog lay curled up in the corner. His coat, a familiar mix of black and tan, gleamed faintly under the fluorescent light. Despite his size, the dog seemed shrunken somehow, his posture rigid, his aura subdued. Jason's heart hammered in his chest as recognition hit him like a tidal wave. He leaned forward, his voice breaking into a whisper. "Max?" The dog lifted his head, his eyes meeting Jason's. But they weren't the eyes Jason remembered. Gone was the bright spark of camaraderie, replaced by a dull, guarded emptiness. There was no tail wag, no movement toward him. Just a long, emotionless stare, as though Jason were no more than a stranger. Jason staggered back, his breath catching. "He doesn't recognize me," he murmured, the weight of the realization pressing down on him. Yet, even as doubt clawed at his resolve, something deeper inside him refused to let go. Max was still Max, his partner, his friend. He had to believe that bond could be rebuilt. The staff member broke the silence. "He's been through a lot," she said softly. "We found him at a smaller shelter out of state. His previous owner surrendered him, said they couldn't handle his anxiety. He doesn't trust easily anymore." Jason swallowed hard. "I know him," he said, his voice barely audible. He was my partner, my best friend." Memories swirled in his mind. The grueling training sessions where trust was forged, the missions where Max's instincts had saved his life, the nights when the dog's presence had been his only solace. And now, the same dog was staring at him with vacant eyes, the connection severed. The staff member opened the kennel cautiously. Max remained still, his body tense as Jason knelt before him. Slowly, Jason extended a hand, his voice trembling as he spoke. "Hey, buddy, "It's me. It's Jason." His words were soft, almost pleading. Max tilted his head, the faintest flicker of recognition in his eyes, but his body remained frozen, his muscles taut. Jason felt the familiar lump in his throat, a mix of frustration and hope welling up inside him. This would be no easy reunion. He knew that much. "Would you like to spend some time with him?" the staff member asked gently. "We could take him out to the play yard." Jason nodded without hesitation, his determination unwavering. If there was even a chance to mend the bridge between him and Max, he was willing to fight for it. Together, they stepped into the unknown, the first tentative steps of a journey toward healing. In the yard, the atmosphere mirrored the tension inside. Max maintained a deliberate distance, his nose twitching as he sniffed the cool air, avoiding any direct interaction. Jason's gaze lingered on the German shepherd, observing every movement with quiet intensity, as if trying to decipher the emotions locked within. The golden hues of the setting sun streaked the sky when Jason made his choice. He turned to the staff member with a firm resolve and said, "I'm taking him home. No matter how long it takes, I'll bring him back." His voice carried the weight of unspoken loyalty, a shadow of the bond they once shared. In that moment, Jason knew Max wasn't the only one in need of rescue. Perhaps this was the start of healing for both of them. The drive home unfolded in uneasy silence. Max lay on the blanket Jason had spread in the truck bed, his body still but his eyes fixed on the window. He avoided looking at Jason, whose glances in the rearview mirror were filled with silent questions. Rejection tugged at Jason's chest, yet he understood. Both of them bore scars, visible and unseen, that had built walls hard to breach. Jason's small house stood at the edge of town, humble and solitary, with an open yard dotted by a few wind-stirred trees. He parked at the entrance, stepping out to call Max, who hesitated at first. After what felt like an eternity, the dog moved, his steps slow and cautious, every motion deliberate as though scanning for danger. Jason led him to the front door, holding it open. "Welcome home, buddy," he said, his voice light but tinged with uncertainty. Max stepped inside, pausing in the entryway, his nose working furiously to map the unfamiliar surroundings. Suspicion radiated from him, a readiness to flee at the slightest alarm. Determined to make Max feel secure, Jason had prepared a corner of the living room with care. A soft, new dog bed, stainless steel bowls filled with water and kibble, and a small collection of toys. "This is your spot," Jason said, gesturing with quiet enthusiasm. But Max didn't budge. Instead, he stood frozen, his wary gaze fixed on Jason. A weary sigh escaped Jason as he turned away to prepare dinner, memories surfacing unbidden. Once, Max would have bounded to him with uncontainable energy, his loyalty as unwavering as the sunrise. But the dog before him now was a shadow of that vibrant companion, broken in ways Jason recognized all too well. As the evening wore on, Max lingered in the same place, his gaze distant, unreadable. Jason glanced at him, speaking softly as if to himself. "I get it, pal. I feel it too. Lost." Later, as he settled into bed, Jason left his door open, a silent invitation for Max to draw closer. When the lights dimmed, he heard the faint padding of paws. Max didn't venture far, choosing to lie near the threshold instead. Jason smiled in the darkness. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The next morning, Jason awoke to the sound of gentle footsteps in the hallway. There was Max, seated by the door, ears perked and eyes trained on him. A flicker of hope stirred in Jason's chest. "Morning, Max," he greeted, his tone deliberately bright. But the dog averted his gaze and retreated to the corner, leaving Jason's fragile optimism to settle like a sigh. Undeterred, Jason spent the day trying to bridge the gap. He threw a tennis ball only to watch it roll away, untouched. He placed fresh food beside Max, but saw the dog approach only after he had left the room. Each effort to connect seemed to vanish into the void between them. By mid-afternoon, frustration pressed on Jason, but he recognized that it wasn't rejection keeping Max at bay. It was fear, mistrust, and the echoes of pain. Determined to take a different approach, Jason went to his closet, pulling out an old, sand-colored military vest. It was worn and frayed, the same one he had worn on missions with Max. As he slipped it on, the familiar scent of distant battlefields enveloped him. "Let's see if this sparks something," he murmured, heading outside to where Max waited. Jason laid the vest on the ground and stepped back, giving the dog space to respond. Max eyed it curiously, his head tilting slightly as he took a hesitant step forward. Jason's heart lifted. For a fleeting moment, it seemed as though some memory had surfaced. The German shepherd sniffed the fabric, his movements deliberate. His eyes softened, and the hollow look seemed to fade, but only briefly. The moment passed, and Max pulled back, his tail low as he retreated, the connection slipping through Jason's grasp like sand. Jason exhaled heavily, feeling hope slip through his fingers once again. That night, he sat on the porch, gazing at the backyard where Max lay still, his eyes fixed on the glittering stars above. "I'm not giving up on you," Jason said aloud, his voice carrying softly into the cool night air. "You never gave up on me when I was at my lowest, and I'm not walking away now." He knew his words were a stretch, a plea to a bond buried beneath layers of pain and silence. But he clung to the belief that it was still there. As the night deepened and the air grew brisk, Jason chose to leave Max be. Heading inside, he left the back door ajar before retreating to his room. Hours later, the faint sound of claws scraping against the wooden floor stirred him awake. Looking toward the foot of his bed, he spotted Max lying there, eyes drooping in the soft glow of moonlight. Jason didn't say a word. He simply smiled in the quiet darkness. The divide between them had narrowed, just enough to reignite Jason's hope. In the days that followed, small yet meaningful shifts began to appear, like cracks in the walls of distrust between man and dog. On Monday morning, while splitting logs in the yard, Jason noticed Max watching from a cautious distance, his head slightly tilted. The German shepherd's tail remained low, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of curiosity. Jason paused, wiping his brow as he turned toward Max. "Wanna lend a hand, buddy?" he called out in a teasing tone. Max didn't come closer, but he didn't shy away either. Later that afternoon, during a quiet walk around the yard, Jason casually tossed a stick ahead. He wasn't expecting much, but to his surprise, Max took a few hesitant steps toward the stick, stopped, and then returned to his spot. Jason chuckled softly. "Ah, so you do remember how to play. Acting like you don't, huh?" Even though it was a timid response, it felt like a step forward. The next day, Jason made a decision. He'd take Max for a walk. Digging through a drawer, he retrieved the dog's old ID tag and polished it until it gleamed. He attached it to a brand new collar and clipped on a leash. "Ready for some fresh air?" he asked, adjusting the strap. When Jason opened the gate, Max hesitated, staring at the world beyond the yard as though it were a battlefield. Still, with a gentle tug and a reassuring tone, Jason coaxed him through. As they walked, Max's movements were stiff, his nose twitching constantly as he sniffed the air. His muscles remained tense, as if bracing for danger around every corner. Jason noticed the unease and spoke in a calm, steady voice. "It's okay, boy. There's nothing to fear here. We're safe." Jason knew his words might not resonate, but he hoped the soothing tone would eventually reach Max. On the way back, a small, yet profound moment unfolded. As Jason removed the leash, Max stepped closer, his nose brushing against Jason's hand. Jason froze, his pulse quickening. "That's it, Max," he murmured softly, careful not to scare him off. Max lingered for a few heartbeats, taking in Jason's scent, before retreating again. That fleeting gesture felt monumental, proof that something inside Max was beginning to shift. That evening, while Jason prepared dinner, Max curled up on the rug just outside the kitchen. It wasn't an invitation for affection, but the nearness alone was enough to give Jason hope. He glanced at Max and whispered, "Looks like we're finding our way back to each other, huh?" Max didn't respond, but his gaze was less guarded, as though a part of him was starting to recognize the man who had once been his world. The next morning, a soft grey mist cloaked the yard, wrapping everything in a delicate haze. Jason rose early, as was his habit, only to find Max, already awake, sitting by the living room window. The dog stared out at the fog, his posture pensive, as though lost in deep thought. Jason approached quietly, careful not to disrupt the fragile peace. "Thinking about something, buddy?" he asked gently, though he knew no answer would come. After breakfast, Jason decided to retrieve something meaningful. From the back of a closet, he pulled out an old wooden box filled with mementos from his military days. Inside, nestled among medals, faded photographs and letters, was a worn rubber ball. It had been Max's favorite toy during breaks on the field. Jason held the ball in his hand for a long moment, feeling the weight of all it represented. Jason stepped into the backyard where Max was resting, the air heavy with an unspoken tension. He took the rubber ball in his hand and dropped it near the German shepherd. Max's gaze followed the ball as it hit the ground, his body stiffening in response. He sniffed the air tentatively, as though the ball carried a trace of something from a distant memory. For a moment, Jason thought Max might ignore it altogether. But then, with deliberate caution, Max inched closer. He sniffed the ball again, only to retreat slightly, his hesitation palpable. Jason observed in silence, his heart aching with hope. "You remember this, don't you?" he asked softly, his voice carrying a note of longing. That afternoon, Jason noticed a subtle but significant shift in Max's behavior. During lunch, Max stayed by Jason's side, shadowing his every move. When Jason offered him food directly, Max hesitated but ultimately accepted, a gesture that felt monumental. Jason maintained his composure, his movements slow and deliberate, so as not to spook the dog. Max ate carefully, his amber eyes never leaving Jason's face, as though testing the waters of trust once more. Later, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Jason sat on the porch, rolling the ball between his fingers. He let out a quiet laugh, the sound tinged with nostalgia. "Remember when you brought me this in the middle of the night because you couldn't sleep?" he murmured, recalling Max's stubborn insistence on playing, even in the most tense of times. "You were relentless. Still are, I guess." With a gentle toss, Jason sent the ball across the yard, not expecting much. To his astonishment, Max's ears perked up, his eyes following the ball's arc, though he didn't chase it. That night, as Max settled near Jason's bed, Jason felt the invisible wall between them begin to crumble. It wasn't just about proximity, something deeper was at work. Though they were both still grappling with their own scars, it felt like they were starting to share the weight of their pain. Before turning off the lights, Jason glanced at Max. "We're getting there, partner," he said quietly. "We're getting there." The following morning arrived with sunlight streaming across the backyard. Jason, determined to rebuild their connection, decided to revisit an old training exercise from their days in the field. Armed with a whistle and a rope, he hoped the routine might ignite a spark of recognition in Max, buried beneath layers of trauma and time. "Take it easy, boy," Jason said reassuringly as they walked to the center of the yard. Max followed cautiously, his focus unwavering. Jason blew the whistle and issued a command. "Sit." For a tense moment, Max remained still. Then, to Jason's astonishment, the dog slowly lowered himself into a seated position. "Good boy," Jason exclaimed, his voice a mix of surprise and encouragement. Picking up the rubber ball, Jason threw it a short distance. "Fetch, Max," he called, injecting a playful energy into his tone. Max hesitated, his sharp eyes assessing the situation. Jason stood motionless, giving him the space to decide. After a few moments, Max took tentative steps toward the ball. He paused, glanced back at Jason, then picked it up in his mouth. A shiver ran through Jason's body. "That's my boy," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Max walked back, dropping the ball at Jason's feet before lifting his head to meet Jason's gaze. In Max's eyes, Jason saw something he hadn't witnessed in years, a flicker of recognition, a glimmer of the bond they once shared. Jason felt tears threaten to spill, but held them back, not wanting to overwhelm the dog with his emotions. The day marked a quiet, yet profound turning point. Throughout the hours that followed, Max stayed close to Jason, occasionally leaning into the man's gestures of affection. When Jason sat on the couch, Max lay beside him, a simple act that carried tremendous weight. It wasn't just the drills or the familiar items, it was the trust that had begun to bloom between them. That night, while sorting through an old box of belongings, Jason unearthed a photo from their time in the field. The snapshot captured them on a day they'd overcome a particularly grueling mission, both weary but glowing with pride. Jason placed the picture on the bedside table, then showed it to Max. "Look at this, boy. We were unstoppable back then, weren't we?" Max gazed at the photo for a moment before settling beside Jason, as if acknowledging the past they shared. The bond, fragile but real, was beginning to mend. Jason stepped into the backyard where Max was resting, the air heavy with an unspoken tension. He took the rubber ball in his hand and dropped it near the German Shepherd. Max's gaze followed the ball as it hit the ground, his body stiffening in response. He sniffed the air tentatively, as though the ball carried a trace of something from a distant memory. For a moment, Jason thought Max might ignore it altogether. But then, with deliberate caution, Max inched closer. He sniffed the ball again, only to retreat slightly, his hesitation palpable. Jason observed in silence, his heart aching with hope. "You remember this, don't you?" he asked softly, his voice carrying a note of longing. That afternoon, Jason noticed a subtle but significant shift in Max's behavior. During lunch, Max stayed by Jason's side, shadowing his every move. When Jason offered him food directly, Max hesitated, but ultimately accepted, a gesture that felt monumental. Jason maintained his composure, his movements slow and deliberate, so as not to spook the dog. Max ate carefully, his amber eyes never leaving Jason's face, as though testing the waters of trust once more. Later, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Jason sat on the porch, rolling the ball between his fingers. He let out a quiet laugh, the sound tinged with nostalgia. "Remember when you brought me this in the middle of the night because you couldn't sleep?" he murmured, recalling Max's stubborn insistence on playing, even in the most tense of times. "You were relentless. Still are, I guess." With a gentle toss, Jason sent the ball across the yard, not expecting much. To his astonishment, Max's ears perked up, his eyes following the ball's arc, though he didn't chase it. That night, as Max settled near Jason's bed, Jason felt the invisible wall between them begin to crumble. It wasn't just about proximity, something deeper was at work. Though they were both still grappling with their own scars, it felt like they were starting to share the weight of their pain. Before turning off the lights, Jason glanced at Max. "We're getting there, partner," he said quietly. "We're getting there." The following morning arrived with sunlight streaming across the backyard. Jason, determined to rebuild their connection, decided to revisit an old training exercise from their days in the field. Armed with a whistle and a rope, he hoped the routine might ignite a spark of recognition in Max, buried beneath layers of trauma and time. "Take it easy, boy," Jason said reassuringly as they walked to the center of the yard. Max followed cautiously, his focus unwavering. Jason blew the whistle and issued a command. "Sit." For a tense moment, Max remained still. Then, to Jason's astonishment, the dog slowly lowered himself into a seated position. "Good boy," Jason exclaimed, his voice a mix of surprise and encouragement. Picking up the rubber ball, Jason threw it a short distance. "Fetch, Max," he called, injecting a playful energy into his tone. Max hesitated, his sharp eyes assessing the situation. Jason stood motionless, giving him the space to decide. After a few moments, Max took tentative steps toward the ball. He paused, glanced back at Jason, then picked it up in his mouth. A shiver ran through Jason's body. "That's my boy," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Max walked back, dropping the ball at Jason's feet before lifting his head to meet Jason's gaze. In Max's eyes, Jason saw something he hadn't witnessed in years. A flicker of recognition, a glimmer of the bond they once shared. Jason felt tears threaten to spill, but held them back, not wanting to overwhelm the dog with his emotions. The day marked a quiet yet profound turning point. Throughout the hours that followed, Max stayed close to Jason, occasionally leaning into the man's gestures of affection. When Jason sat on the couch, Max lay beside him, a simple act that carried tremendous weight. It wasn't just the drills or the familiar items, it was the trust that had begun to bloom between them. That night, while sorting through an old box of belongings, Jason unearthed a photo from their time in the field. The snapshot captured them on a day they'd overcome a particularly grueling mission, both weary but glowing with pride. Jason placed the picture on the bedside table, then showed it to Max. "Look at this, boy. We were unstoppable back then, weren't we?" Max gazed at the photo for a moment before settling beside Jason as if acknowledging the past they shared. The bond, fragile but real, was beginning to mend. The muffled roar of distant thunder sliced through the overcast sky as rain began to fall softly over Jason's backyard. Standing at the window, Jason watched the scene unfold, the coffee mug in his hands warming his fingers. Max, the stoic German shepherd, stood near the edge of the porch, his head lifted toward the horizon. Lightning flashed, illuminating his damp fur, and the rhythmic patter of rain played against the ground. It was as if the dog was mesmerized, caught in the spell of the storm. Jason approached quietly, his voice barely above a murmur. "You've always loved storms, haven't you?" He wasn't sure if he was speaking to Max or to himself. The dog turned his head slowly, his amber eyes meeting Jason's for a fleeting moment. This time, something was different. The wall of distrust that had long stood between them wasn't gone, but a crack had formed. A faint flicker of curiosity replaced the emptiness, stirring something hopeful in Jason's chest. Taking a deep breath, Jason decided to act on instinct. He moved to a drawer in the kitchen, pulling out an old military whistle he hadn't touched in years. The small metal object gleamed faintly in the dim light, carrying the weight of countless memories. Returning to the porch, he gave 2 sharp blows, the same signal he had used during missions to call Max back to his side. The sharp sound cut through the rain, and Max's ears perked immediately. He turned sharply toward Jason, his posture taut with alertness. For one fleeting second, Jason thought the dog might bound toward him like he used to. But Max hesitated. A single tentative step forward. Then he stopped. His eyes clouded with doubt, and he lowered his head, retreating into himself once more. Jason exhaled, a soft sigh of understanding. He pocketed the whistle and crouched down, keeping his tone gentle. "It's okay, buddy. We'll take this at your pace. No rush." As the rain intensified, Jason brought out a dry blanket and a fresh bowl of water, placing them in a quiet corner of the room. This time, he didn't push or coax. Instead, he sat nearby on the floor, giving Max the space to choose. He stayed still, letting his presence speak for him. The tension in Max's body began to ease, and after a while, the dog settled on the rug, his eyes darting occasionally toward Jason as if testing his intentions. Hours passed, and night fell. The storm outside grew fiercer, the wind howling against the windows. Jason was preparing to head to bed when Max did something unexpected. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the dog rose and padded toward him. Jason froze, not wanting to shatter the fragile moment. Max came closer, his breathing heavy in the quiet room, and stopped just inches away. Jason held his breath as the dog sniffed the air, gathering courage. Then, in a move that made Jason's heart race, Max gently nudged Jason's hand with his nose. The contact was fleeting, but it was monumental. Jason's voice caught in his throat as he whispered, "You're coming back to me, boy." He didn't dare reach out, knowing any sudden move could break the fragile trust. He stayed still, allowing Max to dictate the rhythm of their fragile reunion. When Max stepped back, Jason felt an overwhelming wave of hope. It was a small step, but its significance was immeasurable. That night, Jason noticed Max lying at the foot of his bed. The dog's posture was still guarded, but he wasn't as distant as before. The unspoken promise of their bond, still fragile but not broken, filled the room with quiet reassurance. The following morning, sunlight poured over the backyard, the golden warmth chasing away the storm's remnants. Jason stood on the porch, his coffee steaming in the crisp air. Max roamed the damp grass, his movements smoother, more confident. The tension that usually stiffened his frame seemed to loosen in the morning light. Jason watched intently, his hand brushing against the whistle in his pocket. Taking a leap of faith, he blew the familiar signal again, 2 sharp notes. This time, Max's response was immediate. His ears snapped upright, his head turned sharply toward Jason, and his entire body vibrated with alertness. Jason's heart swelled. Max hadn't come running yet, but the recognition in his eyes spoke volumes. Their journey of healing was far from over, but on that bright morning, the gap between them felt smaller than it had in a long time. Jason remained composed, his demeanor steady and unhurried, showing neither impatience nor undue excitement. "Come on, boy," he murmured softly, his voice laced with quiet encouragement. To his astonishment, Max, the German shepherd, began to inch closer, his gaze locked on the whistle in Jason's hand. The veteran felt a tightness rise in his throat as he watched the once-distant dog take hesitant steps toward him, each one a small but significant triumph. Max finally stopped just a foot away, his nose twitching as he sniffed the air, searching for something familiar. Moving deliberately, Jason reached for the rubber ball he'd used earlier. Holding it out for Max to see, he let the moment linger before gently tossing it aside. Max froze momentarily, the tension in his body palpable. But then, as if a switch had been flipped, he darted after the ball with surprising vigor. Retrieving it, he returned and placed it gently at Jason's feet. Jason stood motionless, his eyes brimming with unshed tears. That simple act, so ordinary yet profoundly symbolic, spoke volumes. It was a glimmer of hope, a sign that Max was beginning to break free from the chains of his trauma. "That's it, partner. I knew you were still in there," Jason whispered, his voice thick with emotion. As Max's tail wagged tentatively, a wave of gratitude washed over Jason. It felt as though weeks of patience and unspoken hope had culminated in this one magical moment. For Jason, every step Max took toward healing mirrored his own journey, a shared battle against invisible scars. Later that evening, for the first time since Max had come into his care, the dog curled up beside him on the couch, resting his head near Jason's leg. Jason didn't speak or move, afraid to shatter the fragile moment. Instead, he let the silence envelop them, a silent conversation of trust and newfound connection. Stroking Max's head gently, Jason made a quiet vow. No matter how long the road ahead, he would never abandon the friend who had once saved his life. The next morning began with the cheerful chirping of birds in the yard, but inside Jason's modest home, a milestone was unfolding. In the living room, Max stood in the center, his eyes fixed on Jason, who held a leash in one hand and a military vest in the other. "Today's the big day, buddy," Jason said, a hopeful smile softening his rugged face. He had decided to take Max to the local park, the one they used to frequent during their training days. It was more than an outing. It was a test, a chance to measure how far they'd come in rebuilding trust. On the drive to the park, Max sat in the back seat of Jason's truck, his head leaning out the open window, ears flapping in the breeze. Watching him through the rearview mirror, Jason felt a mix of pride and relief. The weeks of effort, frustration, and determination had led to this moment. "Just like old times, huh?" Jason said, half to himself, his voice tinged with nostalgia. At the park, Jason unclipped the leash and picked up the familiar rubber ball. For a brief moment, Max stood still, surveying his surroundings. But this time, instead of hesitation, he surged forward when Jason threw the ball. They played for hours, the past and its traumas momentarily forgotten. Watching Max run, fetch, and bark with the unbridled joy of his former self, Jason felt his heart lighten. He knew they weren't the same as they once were, but he realized they didn't need to be. Together, they could build something new. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, Jason sat on a weathered bench. Max lay beside him, resting his head on Jason's lap, his steady breaths a soothing rhythm. Jason gazed into the distance, the tension that had gripped him for so long finally easing. "I told you I wouldn't give up, Max," he murmured, running his fingers through the dog's fur. For the first time in years, Jason felt a piece of himself return, a piece he thought he'd lost forever. Max wasn't just a dog. He was a living testament to resilience, a reminder of everything they had endured and overcome. As they headed home that evening, the quiet companionship between them spoke volumes. The road ahead remained uncertain, but Jason knew one thing for sure. They would face it together. Max, with his unwavering loyalty, had reclaimed his place in Jason's heart, and Jason, with his steadfast love, had shown that even the deepest wounds could heal. Their bond was unbreakable, their journey far from over. But now, they were whole again, ready for whatever life would bring. Side by side,